Are some art styles just simply better than others? This is, I guess, look, a pretty silly question, but there is a lot of seriousness to it as well, especially for artists who are looking at becoming professional. There's typically two takes on this that I see. Firstly, you see people say that you just need to find your own unique art style. You need to follow your passions and your dreams and everything will kind of work out. And on the other hand, we often get schooled on what good illustration is, on what good entertainment design is. And if you actually start working, a lot of the time you get hit over the head with this idea of just constantly making things shinier, making things more rendered. And it does seem that there are some styles that people have that work really, really well for that. And there are some that don't. This is something that plagued me early on and probably still does to this day. I think one of the big things that we often have to do is to separate what are those elements that really do make art visually appealing, and then try and separate the things that are really unique about us, about our personality, and try and kind of meld them together. But this is no easy task. So what I want to do in this video is try and unpack that question. Are some styles simply better than others? And more importantly, what can we as artists do about it? As usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is just going to be you and me. We're going to check out some images in Photoshop, maybe some art books, and talk illustration theory and style theory. See if we can get closer to understanding what makes a good image. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. So my goal here really is to try and sort of start this conversation to see if we can think through it a little bit. But, I'd be really keen to know what you have to think on this, what you have to say on this particular topic, what your experience is as an artist, kind of being faced with some of these challenges. This was the case for me early on, is that, my art was a little bit amateurish. And I think when we kind of are at that stage, you often know that in order to get better, in order to get to a professional level, you kind of are going to need to improve it in particular ways. We're often going to need to be able to have more contrast, have stronger compositions, brighter colors. There's often a series of things that we kind of know we need to do in order to gain broader appeal, in order to, make things more polished, more detailed. And I think all of that stuff makes sense, right? I was like, yeah, like fair enough, right? That is also a lot of what I like about art. But often I think also as artists, we also admire artists who are a little bit more artistic, right? For instance, I was really into Frank Frazetta, who had a much more sort of sketchy, loose style. And, it was often really tricky to know, like, why does that person's art work, but my art doesn't work? And I think trying to extract and dice it up is really tricky here. So again, my goal is to start this conversation, see if we can sort of learn a little bit more about this. It's also worth mentioning that, like, from my perspective, even the most egregious kind of Hollywood big budget thing that's kind of meant to appeal to everyone. And, a good example of this would be your classic sort of Michael Bay Transformers movie, right? Which is just a constant collage and barrage of sound and special effects and one-liners and camera moves and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of artistry to that has a point of view. It has a style to it, and I think that's obvious to see, right? And I think there's a lot to like about that stuff. But you do see a lot of these larger stylistic things that tend to happen with, big budget 3D animations that are meant to be for the whole family, huge big budget productions, these kind of massive science fiction superhero movies that are meant to be like, look, they're like funny, they've got action, they got a little bit of romance, they kind of got a little bit of everything for everyone, and that's the only way you can spend $300 to $400 million making one, because everyone's going to go see it. There are just things that kind of tend to happen as you sort of get closer to those sort of larger projects. And often, because they are so large and they are so successful in the marketplace, we often put them a bit on a pedestal stylistically. The first thing that I think is obvious to see is that, like, look, some styles, some ways of making art, like some things are actually better than others in terms of everyone liking them, in terms of it having wider appeal, in terms of it entertaining the eye. And this is often what makes up a lot of classical illustration theory, compositional practice. And much of this is, it's just simply a matter of like drawing people's eye to the art, like maintaining their sort of eye flow, and also, being clear and simple. I think often a major sort of part of this is that the more clear and simple you can be about the message that you're telling, the easier it is for sort of everyone to sort of understand it. Whereas often, I think styles that are a little bit more sort of personal or independent are often a little bit more ambiguous, right? And the viewer has to do more work to really sort of figure out what's going on there. Like, I think like a good quote that I forget where this sort of comes from, but someone said that like true art completes itself in the viewer's mind. There's a certain degree to where like quote unquote good art from a certain perspective requires challenge. It requires the audience to participate in the art. And I think as artists, we often like that type of art more. Like the reason that I think artists often are more drawn to sketchy styles, to preparatory work, is that we can kind of complete those things ourselves. It allows us as artists to be drawn into that process, because we're often seeing like a really nicely unfinished painting, right? Something that requires a little bit more imagination. And it's so important to understand that a huge percentage of the population have no interest in doing that. They physically cannot do that. They have no idea what you're talking about. They're just like, this is unfinished and I can't even tell what's going on. I mean, to the point where like often I think like if we sort of view often like the sketchiness that artists often really sort of appreciate, where you can see a lot of brush strokes and maybe even you can see like construction and fluidity with the drawing and it's expressive. Like a lot of people can't even understand what that is. Like they're looking at it, and especially I've sort of done this a couple of times where I show it to like someone who's younger, right? Sort of like pre-teen sort of thing, and be like, can you even tell like what this is? And often they can't, right? They're just like, I don't like that, right? Like I like this other sort of style of drawing. And I think this is often why sort of earlier on people have a lot of trouble when it comes to learning things like construction drawing and these sort of multiple steps, right? People always want to imagine that you're just drawing the finished image, right? That's always sort of really interested in. And I think it's obviously why art that is sort of very simple and clear, like manga, where we have big eyes, big expressive faces, a lot of these kind of cartoony styles, or very realistic styles that are very easy for everyone to kind of understand. There's a lot of these things that kind of just tend to work. Everyone can kind of look at it and appreciate it. And it requires very little work from the audience to kind of figure it out. So a lot of illustration theory is aimed at us figuring this out, like making things more visually interesting, telling really clear stories, and making sure that we abstractly draw the eye. These are things that I've talked about quite a bit on the channel, trying to really dissect a lot of the ways that things like color theory, tonal versus color contrast function, etc. Like if you kind of figure these out at a really basic level, I think it's easy to kind of apply them to a huge variety of different styles. But these are often the things that we're going to find in a book like Edgar Payne's Composition of Outdoor Painting from, a long time ago, right? Just simple ideas of how to select compositions, how to sort of mass shapes, how to create clarity, how to draw the eye, how to simplify things. And, this is something that people have been trying to do for a long time, right? There's a lot of wisdom here, obviously. And I think it's easy to look at a lot of the sort of more successful styles or things that are very shiny, things that really work in the world, and, maybe sort of shy away from that a little bit, especially in the beginning. Because it does feel a little bit derivative or formulaic. But the reality is that there are many sort of formulas that really define what does work pretty well. And this is because we can sort of really see what works on the level of the eye, right? Like what draws the eye and how the eye sees things, and how you can develop a sketch. And this is a creative illustration, by the way, by sort of Andrew Loomis. And he sort of just talks about a lot of these sort of basic ways of sort of building images, right? Thinking about sort of massing shapes, being clear, like this stuff is so important when it comes to designing your tonal patterns, sketching, right? And even sort of more in the beginning, right? Like thinking about composition, thinking about how you might organize things within the image to entertain the eye, right? Like there's definitely some things that work well. And I think you might obviously say like, right, but this has nothing to do with style. But I think in the beginning, it's easy to get those mixed up, right? When someone kind of says you need more contrast, or you need to mass your shapes better, or you need to kind of constantly have a different type of composition or sort of shot selection in your scene. Because often, again, very sort of unique shot selection can be a part of style, right? So these are the kind of things that I would sort of face early on, right? I was, always trying to think about, how to give things a lot of sort of impact. And I was not really that attached to having, I guess, a particular style that much. I just kind of wanted to become a professional. And I guess a big part of what and how this stuff really affects us as artists is we're often trying to figure out, like making a cover, right? Making a cover is the ultimate version of this, where, this cover for Pinocchio has to, catch someone's attention in a bookshop full of hundreds, thousands of other books in order for it to be successful. And it's very hard to become a professional artist or make your art good if you don't incorporate a lot of these ideas. But still, probably if you notice, like the challenge is, I have a book that maybe I don't want it to be screaming, right, from the rafters, right? Maybe it's a little bit more subtle. And I think this is where we'd often have these kind of challenges, right? I'm like, no, but I'm drawing like a moody forest, right? And this is like a very moody sort of dark book. I don't necessarily want it to be all sort of shiny and sort of jumping off the page. It's sort of very serious. I don't want the main character Ara to be like, sort of in some crazy manga pose, sort of jumping. It's very sort of serious. And again, I think this is where those feelings of the style we want and etc. can really sort of challenge your ability to just jump straight in and be like, okay, let's make eyes bleed. Let's make this just punch people in the face from across the room. And I think this is often a bit of that sort of conflict that exists. Similar when we're sort of looking at Pinocchio. Again, I'm trying to sort of create a cover that has a lot of drama. Luckily, we had this kind of shiny gold, which is just absolute magic. It's such a, again, it's a cheap trick, but it works really, really well. But again, you can see I sort of struggled a lot throughout my career to try and make my art have more contrast, have more impact. But also, I was drawn to trying to think about creating a mood and stuff that felt a little bit more subtle. And I think when you get into conflict with these, it can cause a massive amount of problems. Again, not because there's any real problem, but as artists, because we're sort of overthinking it and often getting into conflict with ourselves. So one of the things that I would always look at when I was sort of trying to think through this is the art of Darrell K. Sweet, who's like a very sort of famous, popular, prolific cover artist. A lot of sort of classic fantasy covers from sort of, I guess, sort of 80s and 90s, etc. Kind of had his work. Here's a pastiche of Dean Cornwell illustration, but I would just always look at how, like, some people, I think, are just able to combine that eye-bleeding, perfect sort of illustration and almost like going further, right? Like really always like turning everything up to 11, right? I think like Michael Bay, right, classic sort of Transformers director, is often sort of, sort of given a lot of heat, a lot of flack for doing this. But I think knowing how to turn up that dial and how to really say like, okay, let's just paint this bright red. It's like out of the tube red. And then you got these kind of clouds that are, they're kind of melodramatic, right? The whole thing is melodramatic. The whole thing is like over the top, but it really, really works as a cover. And I think it was almost that, like, I would and this is the other thing, is like you can often be sort of pulled away from this by thinking about what should be real, right? Like what is good, like it doesn't make any sense that you would have something that bright red against something that bright blue. You don't see that in reality. But again, it's this sort of hyper realistic sort of look that's so kind of interesting. And I think he would often just be able to have this bright blue and these bright greens and bright yellows and just sort of do this crazy stuff. So, it was a constant struggle for myself to really figure out how to access, I guess, that kind of attitude and sort of understand how this mixes with like realistic painting or with sort of illustration. And again, I just find, like, let me know in the comments down below, but I find this to be like a real sort of challenge, especially early on as an artist. So a lot of, I guess, what we're really talking about here is, as I was sort of hinting at, this idea of balancing mass appeal, wide appeal, stuff that everyone is gonna kind of like, versus having a stronger point of view. And it's important to, when you're working in the entertainment industry or sort of doing anything as an artist, to really have a good understanding of this. And I think this is so critical when you're starting out. And I feel like, for instance, for me, if I had just kind of kept drawing my comics in my style, I'm pretty confident I would have kind of found something that kind of worked. And I would have found a situation where, like, I sort of put a stake in the ground and said, like, this is what I'm doing. And you kind of interact mostly with other people looking at it and viewing it. And you, I think, will often kind of really find a good niche. And that's what a lot of video games, a lot of independent artists on sort of social media are able to do. I think some tend to get a little bit sort of attracted to the shiny, right? And they are sort of trying to make these kind of viral art styles and try and get the most people to kind of look at it. Again, I think that there's a lot of success also in creating something that's very unique that a lot of people are really going to connect with, and they're really connecting with you as an artist. And that's a very powerful connection, and you can have a lot of success there, right? So I think, like, that's a good example where, as an artist, we often start with a pretty strong point of view just because we're people. And it's this sort of desire to often go through gates with gatekeepers who say, like, you shall not pass until you have this level of contrast or this level of shininess or this level of visual appeal, or you're trying to get a job at a large entertainment design company, again, working in feature animation, feature film, VFX, video games. You're trying to get book covers for, like, very, very big publishers where they're going to try and get 1 million people to buy this book. You're trying to illustrate trading cards for, like, the best, TCG sort of company or whatever. Again, there are certain requirements there because these things are huge projects with huge numbers of people who need to be like, yay, that's great. And just by default, in order to make something have that kind of mass appeal, we need to firstly, like, apply all of that good illustration logic, like apply all of good picture making, all of the good cinematography, all of the good design. Like, we obviously have to do that, but I think often mixed in with that is this need to make it appeal to everyone. And in order to make it appeal to everyone, right, we got these sort of family 3D animated movies that kind of everyone has to watch. Everyone has to think it's okay. That, you tend to file off the edges. You tend to remove stuff that people are not going to like. And I think there is just a tendency within large business to aim for the widest TAM, right? Total addressable market, right? That's the kind of thing that people are thinking about. It's like, file off that edge, because the more you file off that edge, you increase the TAM, right? And they're like, blah, blah, blah. All these acronyms, right? Like, that's how a lot of people think at the top level when you got hundreds of millions of dollars in play. And, like, fair enough, right? Because, that's really important. Otherwise, there's not going to be a second one. There's not going to be a company, because you just pour all this money in here and, like, you make this great thing, but your total addressable market is like 10%, 20% smaller because a couple of people were like, oh, I don't really like that. And then everything falls apart and you kind of, everyone ends in poverty and loses their job, right? So look, it's not to say that this is a simplistic argument, right? But I think it's just important as an artist in the beginning to understand why certain things look a particular way, and often why, like, video game splash screen art looks a particular way, why, book covers have to be really sort of shiny, why a lot of this illustration has to be really shiny, why a lot of concept art for video games is there to make things like super clear, and a lot of styles that really work are very sort of realistic styles, except for when World of Warcraft or something comes out and everyone sort of gets really used to looking at sort of cartoony stylized World of Warcraft art, and then that becomes viable. Why? Because again, we know everyone likes it, so the TAM for that is sort of huge. And yeah, it's just important to understand, like, as an artist there, that like it's very tricky to get a company that's larger, that has a lot of money to spend, that's going to employ you in any way, shape, or form, to be interested in a stake in the ground that is connected to you, a style that is connected to you. It's going to be someone who's very, very high up at the company, who is, putting their stake in the ground, because that's where they're going to put all their sort of eggs. So it's just always just one of these things where, like, when you are entering these industries, it does really feel like there are better styles, and there are styles that are more successful, and there are things that get you a lot of status, and there are things that make you a lot of money if you get good at them. And I think what's less obvious is that it maybe is possible to build a much more sort of successful existence as an artist, and maybe a more fulfilled one, kind of really putting your stake in the ground and kind of saying, this is what I'm about. And you're not going to have the largest TAM, the total addressable market, but the people who are interested in that are probably going to be more interested in it than they are in that sort of family movie that everyone is going to watch, right? Because it really speaks something to them, and you have a much deeper connection as someone who's making something, and someone who's kind of looking at that thing or consuming that content, or whatever you want to call it. Now, it is worth mentioning that sometimes you do get really weird stuff happening. You can often get styles that are really cut against the grain of what is sort of possible, but they still have like a massive, rabid appeal to a large variety of people. And I think this often happens with music, right? Music tends to be generational, where you can have stuff that is obscenely popular, but, maybe 80% of the population hates it, right? And you do get that with art. And I think one person who's been really good at doing this, as an example, is Rob Liefeld. Now, a lot of people love to hate on Rob Liefeld, and especially artists, and probably you would sort of imagine I'm one of those people, but I'm actually not. I quite like the story of Rob Liefeld. Rob Liefeld has a great sort of podcast where he talks about a lot of sort of cool comic book stuff that, if you're into, is sort of fascinating. And I think it's important to kind of look at what happens with this stuff, because this is often exactly what just annoys especially aspiring artists, but kind of everyone, just so much, as you kind of look at this. And Rob Liefeld kind of has this questionable drawing craft, right? There's often a lot of sort of iffy stuff here. But, the reality is, like, Rob Liefeld was obscenely successful, both financially and creatively, got to create a lot of sort of cool stuff. And I think, still today is like pretty successful in general in sort of like what he's doing. I think like has a really good attitude that's worth paying attention to as a creator, and as someone who's like making stuff, and again putting a stake in the ground and saying like, this is what I think is cool. So anyway, that's not really what I'm talking about though. What I'm saying is that, like, often if you really have like a unique point of view, right? Like Rob Liefeld had this kind of art style that was sort of aggressive, right? Like everyone is screaming, everyone is furious, everyone is tense, everyone is like just filled with this teenage angst, this rage. And I think like a lot of people who were in that sort of target market, right, and the total addressable market was a lot of people who really resonated with that particular kind of attitude. And I think this is where you can easily get stuff that has like a really strong point of view that a lot of people are going to hate with a passion of a thousand burning suns, and it still becomes super, super popular. And also that this often doesn't have the most to do with like perfect draftspersonship, perfect everything, perfect anatomy, all the things that we kind of consider. It's really important to see like how often those things aren't actually that valuable. Like what is valuable is a point of view, is someone connecting with their audience in a very sort of visceral way. And these kind of styles are like, like this aged out pretty significantly, right? Like it sort of burnt really fast, right? And didn't burn that long. That sort of 90s art style. But I think it's important to look at this because you see this kind of coming along every now and then. Someone really hits a nerve and becomes really successful. And I think there's so much opportunity for young artists as well to really tap into that and try and do kind of a similar thing. Anyway, so I think it's always worth looking at these things that I think sort of are successful and really looking at kind of why, because I think as an artist, you can learn a lot about these. And yeah, I mean, the other thing that's kind of worthwhile, I guess this is kind of funny, is like if you sort of compare it to like a lot of the work that I do, you can kind of see like there's no comparison. Like on the bookshelf, like I lose every time to Rob Liefeld, right? This has just got so much energy, so much color, so much like anger, so much violence, so much like busyness. It's not necessarily succeeding on every level of illustration, right? Like it's a little bit busy, but again, the busyness really sort of gives it that sort of frantic, chaotic, angsty kind of ragey look. And yeah, you can just see how people would be so into that. If you're kind of, like a young boy and you kind of see this stuff that you're like, yes, this is for me. But let's go back to this idea of functionality, of technical limitation, and often this is linked to the mediums that we're trying to work in, the industries. But I think if we go back and understand how often the functionality of art is a major key, it's a major window with which you can view this entire problem and often solve a lot of these challenges. It's a real crucible for the sort of chaos of these different ideas that you can use to really narrow down what you actually want to do. So I'll use as an example something that I think is very interesting because it talks to how often the things that we are taught to appreciate or aspire to in a particular industry can often be sort of cutting against the grain of what might be natural and what might actually work really, really well. So we'll jump over to Photoshop and I'll show you a couple of examples of things that I think are really sort of fit this particular idea. But the goal here is to understand that if you sort of look at what makes art appealing in general, like if you stick to those core illustration principles, I think it's always going to serve you pretty well. But also understand that there's other things there that are very much linked to when we're trying to aspire to get big jobs or get fancy sort of credits or whatever. There are things there that are linked to that style where people are often talking about this, but actually they are also really trying to create broadly appealing styles and do things that also fit into a production style and an overall sort of production workflow where you have hundreds of people working on something. And often there are really good solutions that they're not going to choose because it just doesn't make any sense to have 100 people working with a really, really simple art style. So as an example of where I've been trying to think my way through some of these things personally, and I'll go a lot deeper into my journey and, how I kind of have thought about this stuff throughout my career. But this is a quick example that I think is super effective to kind of look at how you might reframe some of these ideas. But, I grew up aspiring to be a comic book artist and then getting into the French comic book industry. And you'll see that like when you do that, there's certain things that become aspirational for you to achieve in terms of your style. Like one of those is having very sort of detailed backgrounds, right? It's having a particular storytelling style and it's getting used to having many panels on a page, spending that sort of week per page, getting like a really high quality result. And what's aspirational is to get better and better and better at making more better art, more detailed art in that sort of time frame. And that's a completely different sort of attitude you would get than if you're working in the Japanese market, where maybe you were working and trying to create 30 pages a month or 20 pages a week or something like that. You get sort of pushed towards very different ideals about what should or should not happen within your story. And I sort of worked towards that quite a bit. I sort of got better and better at sort of adding detail and trying to paint the backgrounds and, sort of add nuance to scenes and sort of really tried to sort of work the surface of the painting a lot. And one of the things that would was interesting is like the more I kind of did this, the more this became associated with what was my style. And I think I was trying to, again, climb the ranks of like adding more detail, adding more polish, just making art that I felt was like better and higher quality. And the interesting thing is like if you look at sort of the Star Atlas core book that I've been doing sort of more recently, it's a very sort of different style, and it's built for a slightly different production process. It's a lot quicker. And the interesting thing is it's often quite challenging to get people to buy into a style like this. I think I was very sort of lucky to have a team who really kind of supported my vision for this and sort of liked the simple Saturday morning cartoon style look of the project. But the idea here is like, well, okay, maybe I can try and produce more comic book art in a shorter amount of time. And this is going to change what I actually sort of value about the art and what I'm going to focus on and how I'm going to try and make it better and how I'm going to try and use all those illustration ideas, all those concepts of making the eyes bleed, like drawing the eye, creating like designs, like trying to pull every lever I can, but doing so with a much simpler style, with a sort of a flatter, cel-shaded look. And this is something that actually, like again, directly related to this, it took me a long time and was quite tricky for me to really sort of push this on publishers. I would say this idea got rejected 5 times over the course of probably sort of 10 years, right? Where me trying to be like, how about I do it like this? Here's a pitch for something. And people did not want that, right? They wanted something was a little bit more like this kind of painted look, right? Like something with more rendering. And again, this is because, that is what's valued from an artist when someone else is writing it and someone else is sort of publishing it. And it was less a matter of sort of telling the story and building sort of characters and trying to do all that stuff myself. Again, when you're trying to aspire to get into a particular industry, they're going to obviously say, hey, this is what we want you to do. This is who we want you to be. And that may not be who you actually want to be. That may not be how you want to sort of spend your time. So anyway, that's like a small sort of little window into how sort of challenging, I guess, some of this stuff can be. But one of the reasons that I really sort of got interested in working in a simpler style is, talking to Ari Gibson, who created Hollow Knight, right? Which I think is like a really sort of popular product, right? It's done really, really well. And, one of the things he would say is like, man, like working with a much simpler style is so much easier, right? Because you can create a lot more characters. You can create a much larger world if you kind of make the style really simple. And I think he's always really clever when he sort of talks about that stuff. I'm always sort of keen to hear his thoughts. And you can see that idea really followed through Hollow Knight, because again, if you're not aware, like all the art is done by essentially one person. And the breadth and the scale of it and the sophistication of it and the sheer number of characters, the sheer amount of content is absolutely crazy. And I think it is. He sort of said it's because the style is simple, it allows him to create such a variety of different characters. And that's what allows a very small team to create a project that has like a more niche look, that has a real point of view, that has a definitive style, but also has a lot of quality, right? It kind of competes with these AAA products that have a lot more budget and they have a lot more people working on them. And I think often when you view it through the frame of like, what is actually better for me as someone who wants to create my own thing, like what facilitates me to sort of create the most or create the most sort of personality to really create the best product, it's often not what you're going to be told to do if you're working or aspiring to work at a larger studio. So I think that's like something that's really interesting, is that as you sort of work in different industries and get pushed around, and sometimes for good reason, right? Sometimes, again, a lot of people are just telling you to do basic stuff that you're not doing. But also, again, as I said, mixed into this is a lot of ideology and a lot of thought process that's actually specific to that medium, specific to these large production processes. And if you kind of just ignore that and think about, like, again, what might be sort of simpler or faster or more effective, or what would be more personal, what would allow you to really have a stronger point of view, you can often find really unique solutions that make a lot of sense that just no one else is doing. And especially, people are not doing them in big studios, that there's no glamour associated with it. But nevertheless, you can really connect with an audience and create amazing things. Okay, so those are some, I guess, different thoughts and ideas on how we could view whether a style is good or bad, or I guess whether the choices you're making in the different things that you pursue with your art, like, are these good or are these bad? This is just one of these things that I feel like is worth talking to, because I know it really trips people up early on. We can feel like we're headed in a good direction, and you can have a lot of people telling you, make your art more like this because then it'll be better, you'll get a job, and this is like good. And it is good, but it's good as long as you are aiming to work more in that industry, to get more status in that industry, to climb the ladders within that industry. And as long as you stay within that industry, it's fine, right? Everyone is kind of singing the same tune. But I think it's always important to understand that there are other worlds out there. There are other options out there. And not all of them require you to file off the edges of your personality or your style or what you're trying to do. And you can often find really, really unique, interesting options and choices where, again, as we saw with Rob Liefeld, where even craft is not actually that much of a concern. That if you can really communicate and connect with people, then that is something that those people think is really, really good. And they can think that regardless of whether or not it includes a lot of these other illustrative qualities that we often really, really appreciate. So this is coming, by the way, from someone who spent 10 years teaching a lot of these basic illustration concepts and really trying to help people get jobs in these industries. So, I really believe in those pathways. I think that often people create amazing things in those big budget productions. There's nothing sort of bad about that. But again, it is worth considering and understanding this, because I think if you can have a good picture and understanding of what you're actually trying to do, it's a lot easier to kind of take it for what it is. Like, I'm just trying to make my art like this so I can get into this particular industry. And I think the more you take a pragmatic approach there, as opposed to sort of maybe an ideological, sort of very sort of emotional approach to it, like, I really need to make my art exactly like this, it's easy to lose yourself in that process and not really understand which aspects of the skills you're building to get into a particular industry are based on the traditions of illustration and picture making and cinematography that have existed forever, because they're based on how the human brain works, and which things are just there so some executive can increase their TAM and make an extra $20 million bonus that year. And again, in order to do that, they might need to file a few edges off, but again, that's how the sausage is made. Anyway, as I said, let me know what you think of this one in the comments down below. I'd love to get your take on this. Again, this is maybe, I don't know, maybe a hot take, maybe not. Again, my goal is to be a little bit more nuanced, but who knows? Anyway, other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.